Okay, what I'm going to be doing today is going over an explanation of the rendering pipeline. You want to be able to understand the entire pipeline of creating nice renders, because most people just think, oh, you just turn up the render settings, but there's more to it than that. So I wanted to go over a render pipeline today, and then I'm going to take a piece of an environment that one of my students has done, and then I'm going to do my treatment on it and explain kind of how I would approach it and how I would make certain changes and maybe even incorporate a little concept into the piece so that it's more than just a room, but it actually has, you know, something more to it that you could talk to people about, where you've gone in and added an extra little piece to it, where you've had a thought process so you can kind of convince people not only do you have good skills in building things, but you also are a conceptual person as well. So let's go into it and let's see what we got. Okay, so here we have an overview of the rendering pipeline. So when you're trying to get some quality renders, there is an actual hierarchy of the way the information is calculated. It starts off with your shaders and materials. Then from there, it's handed off to your lights, and the lights do two things. They create lights and they create shadows. And then it's passed on to your render itself, where you've set up a bunch of settings on it. And then you get to your final image, okay? So right off the bat, one of the issues that I see a lot of students dealing with is understanding of how to get the shader a little bit higher quality. Right under here on reflections, you have a section called glossy samples, and this controls the quality of the reflection and the glossiness, okay, the specular highlight that's on the shader, and that's controlled by this. So by default, this is set to 8. And so by kicking it up, then you get a little bit higher quality of highlight on the piece. A lot of times students are rendering things and it's kind of noisy and they're kicking up their render settings, but they don't understand why they can't get the noise out of their highlights. That's because it begins here. This is the first stage of actually getting a quality render, is making sure that you have enough samples in that. Okay. Then in your lights, okay, now in your lights, you have quality of shadows. And so in your rendering shadow samples down here, this is where you're kicking up the quality of the shadows of the piece. Okay. So, you know, you got a good quality shader, but then you've got to have a good quality shadow as well. Okay. Then that's passed on to your render settings. And a lot of times I see people making insane settings on their renders, like they'll kick up this final gather really high, not understanding really what final gather does. For all practical purposes, if you have a fairly noisy render, and what I mean by that is you have a lot of things in your render, if you're kicking up this final gather, you're taking a long time to render, but you're not getting much out of it, okay? Really, the image precision is the one that controls a lot of the grain inside of your render, so it's the one that you want to kick up a little bit. And you don't have to click it up all the way. I'm going to show you some examples, but this is a typical rendering setting right here that I'm going to render with, where I leave everything as default other than I just turn up the image precision. Now, there are certain times and certain situations where I do need to increase some of these, but in most cases, if it's a fairly average to dark room and you have a lot of items in it, a lot of textures and patterns, you don't need to be kicking up a lot of this, because a lot of what you're doing is, yes, the quality will be a little bit better, but the time to render it will go up tremendously for a very minimal gain. So you have to be careful in just kicking things up, because now your render's taking an enormous amount of time to render. Okay, let's talk about samples. Okay, now what are samples? Well, the way you can kind of think of it is, in a square, what it's doing is it's having light rays or photons that are being calculated, bounced into this square. So if you have a shadow sample of 32, that means there are 32 randomly sampled areas within this square to calculate the shadow. Okay, if you turn it up to 64, then that means there's 64 pieces of information here, 64 light rays or photons that are bouncing inside of this square to calculate it. So the more samples, the higher your accuracy, but the longer it takes to render. So the thing is to find where is that sweet spot where you have enough samples so that it looks good, but not too many samples so it takes forever to render. And that's the same in your shadows and in your glossy samples as well. It works the same way. So in glossy, then we're calculating, we're putting, like in this case right here, 32 samples in there to calculate the quality of the glossiness. Okay. So this setting calculates the specular on it, and this setting calculates the shadow. And what we're doing is we turn them up. We have higher quality, but slower render times. Okay. So here's some comparisons. So these are shadow comparisons where what I'm doing is turning up the samples on the shadows, and then I'm putting render time in here as well, so you can see, you know, what how this affect our rendering. Okay, so this is the default of 32 shadow samples. That's the default. So when you create a photometric light, that's what its default is 32 samples. And it's going to take this particular piece took 15 seconds to render. Now, what you're looking for here is this penumbra, this fall off on the edge of this shadow. Okay, the graininess of it. Okay, forget about the shader right now because that's a different part. Right now we're dealing with the shadow samples, which is the graininess here. Okay, so when you go over here, now I've turned it up to 64 shadow samples, and it's gone from 15 seconds to 25 seconds. So that's a pretty decent jump. Not a really bad, but it's, you know, that's all, not quite twice as much. But now you're going to see you get a little bit better quality in your render right here. It's not as grainy in here. Here's another one where I kicked it up to 128 samples. Now it jumped up to 47 seconds. So that's quite a bit of a jump. That's 3 times as long to render. Okay. And really, if you look at the quality of this shadow and you look at the quality of this shadow, it's probably maybe only about a 5% increase in the quality, but a huge jump. Okay. It's over, you know, it's practically twice as long to render this for about a 5% increase in the shadow quality. So is it worth that? Or here is, which I never really kick it up to 256, but I see one of my students and what we're going to be talking about, you know, kicked this up to 256. So I was curious. And so I went ahead and did that. And then it jumped up to 1 minute and 33 seconds. So between the default, it took 15 seconds to calculate this shadow, to 256 samples took 1 minute and 33. That's a huge increase in render time. Okay. Probably to me, and this will be different according to how bright your room is and how dark your room, but probably something like 64 samples is probably the good sweet spot where you're getting a higher quality shadow, but it's not costing you a tremendous amount of time in rendering. Okay. Now let's look at the shader here, the glossy samples of the shader. So in other words, we're not doing shadow now, but what we're doing is the highlight. Now, if you'll look in this is the default Max, the Arch and Design material, which is what I'm using here, defaults to 8 glossy samples. Okay. And that took 15 seconds to render this. And by the way, all of these renders I'm calculating are based on the default render settings of a low quality. So when I do my comparisons, I leave it at the default settings. That way everything is equal. Okay. So you're going to get a little bit of graininess just because this is a low quality render. See the graininess that's in this highlight? You get a lot of almost like little speckly in here. Okay. That's your glossy samples. Okay. Now if you go over here 16, so we've doubled that to 16 glossy samples. Look, it only took 1 second longer to render, but it started cleaning this up quite a bit. I can still see some grain in it, but you know, it's that double of 16. It only went up 1 second. And now I go over here to 32 glossy samples, and now it's all that grain is almost completely gone. Okay. And it only took 2 more seconds to calculate than the 8 glossy samples, but I'm going to get a much better specular highlight. Double that again to 64 glossy samples, and that took to 21 seconds. That's still not a huge increase in time, but I don't know how much quality I gained in this particular situation from here to here. They're almost identical. This is a little bit better, but not a lot better. So maybe the sweet spot in this specific situation is 32 glossy samples for just a little bit of kick in render time, but not much. Okay. Now, let's do a render comparison here. Now, what I've done here is I've rendered 2 renders here. And one of these, I'm using what I considered was that sweet spot, which was 32 glossy samples for my specular and 64 shadow samples for my shadow. This was your default rendering right here of a low 2.5 quality, and that took 25 seconds to render. Okay. A little bit of graininess in here. Now, if I just do nothing else other than just kick up the image precision right here, and I kicked it up from low to medium, which is a 1 point on your quality versus 0.25 on your quality here, 32 seconds to render, so it only kicked it up a little bit in render time, but now this is a very nice rendering. The quality of the shadow is very nice. The quality of the specular is really nice. And so I'm not kicking up everything to these insane numbers. I'm just keeping them small increases, but it really got the quality to the level that what I needed. Okay, so now let's put some of this knowledge in action here, okay? So this is one of my students' rooms. It's a pretty nice room. It's done a very nice job on this, but I'm just going to kind of tweak this room. I do this a lot of times to show students different ways that they can kind of increase the quality of what they're doing. So it's a nice piece. Started off really well, and it's done a pretty nice job in here. But there's some issues with it, and I'll just show you some of the things that I would have done. Now, right off the bat, let's look at how he's set his lighting up. Okay, so now we're in Max here. He's using Max. All these principles that I'm talking about are the same inside of Maya. Maya is the same as Max. Okay, same renderer. It's mental ray. It's not any different in Max than it is Maya. It's the exact same render engine. The controls are a little bit different. How you get to the controls is a little bit different. I see people all the time say, "Oh, Maya renders so much better than Max." That's all crap. It's the same render engine. They're just the controls a little bit different, but it's the same engine within both of those. Okay, so what we're going to look here is his lighting. Now, what he has here is he's got 3 lights, okay, that are pointing down, and they're kind of like he's treating them like they're projector lights, almost like you've got these, projectors in here that are projecting a light down. Now, one of the things I have to applaud this student for is he actually was trying to realize where is the light coming from in the room, because a lot of students just want to randomly put lights out in the room, and so they have these really funky kind of looks because that light's coming from nowhere. The light inside of a room, you need to treat it like it's a real room. If we were really inside this room, the light is coming from somewhere, a lamp somewhere, a window, overhead light, a lamp on a desk, somewhere, okay? Now, so what he decided to do was to actually come in and place them like they were little spotlights in here, okay? And to a certain degree, that's okay, but it's kind of odd because nobody would ever set their studio up that way, okay? You have to think about it. Think about this. If you were going to actually set this studio up this way, that means that if I'm sitting here at this desk and I'm working, I've got the lights coming from over my shoulder, and then I'm going to have shadows and everything, and I'm not going to be able to see what I'm doing. This is not practical lighting for what we're actually trying to do, okay? So that's why this lighting in here doesn't look very good to me. I mean, yes, it illuminates it, but it looks like to me, it's almost like somebody took a wall down and drove a car in here and are shining their headlights on our objects in here and throwing these harsh shadows on this back wall in here. This is not a very realistic lighting scenario. And so, I have some issues with that. One other thing I wanted to go over while we're talking about this is some odd things about his lights, okay? Because right off the bat, if we click on the light, and we go to its controls over here, we see that this light is a rectangle and it's 4 feet by 2 feet, okay? And I look at that and I'm going, okay, that's supposed to be 4 feet wide, but this chair, okay, I know that chair's not 4 feet wide, so how is that, okay? And what this student did was one of the cardinal sins of lighting is he scaled his light. I don't know why he scaled his light, but he came in here and scaled the light, okay? That totally screws up this light, okay? Watch when I reset the light back to its natural state. So I'm going to go over here to my hierarchy, reset X-form, reset selected, and watch what happens to this light when I do that. Now it goes back to its real size, okay? Now that's a 4-foot light, okay? So now that's the scale that this light really is. If he wanted the reflector down smaller for some reason, then you just set the reflector down smaller. You come in here and say, okay, because the light a good portion of the light, probably a good 70% of the light. About 25 to 30% is coming from the little ball, but the other part is coming from this panel, which means the larger I make this panel, the softer the light is. The smaller I make the panel, the harder the edge of the shadow that it's making. So if he wanted a harder shadow and wanted this small, then just make the reflector small. You should not be scaling your object in here, your light. That really screws that light up. So don't want to be doing that. Don't use the scale tool. This scale tool is kind of the evil tool. You have to be careful how you use it. I see people just scale all the time. And when you scale something, it screws up the relationship of the object to the world, okay? The world thinks it's its original size. The object thinks it's a smaller size. Now they're not in conjunction with each other. A lot of the processes that we're doing are based on world scale, not object scale, so you get some weird things going on. So be careful of using the scale tool. Okay, so here's the piece. And a couple other things that I would have done. He did a nice job. The floor's looking pretty nice. Got some nice baseboard in here. Very nice things. One of the things that I initially had a conversation with the student was there's just too much black in here. Okay, it's just black, 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 black. Okay, which is kind of boring. And I tried to get him to put a pattern like on the chair, and then he didn't want to put a pattern because he said he was into leather. Well, it doesn't matter that you're into leather. That's not relevant to anything. I'm not asking you to buy the chair, okay? We're trying to create a nice illustration. And so being able to warm the chair up as a focal point would be nice. A couple other things that I would have done in here is right off the bat, you can see the speaker that he's got. Well, the shader in here, you can see how razor sharp the edge of this shader, this box is. That's because whoever modeled it didn't put some kind of a filleted or chamfered, a manufactured edge on it, which it needs to. So you can do that, go and manipulate the model, but what I did was just add it into the shader because a mental ray shader, unlike some other render engines, mental ray has a shader attribute that allows you to round the corner to get a little highlight in there, which is what I did in mine. Okay. The other thing that was when I looked at this piece is if you look really down here, you can see he's got some little funky little shadows in here because he did an ambient occlusion to pass, which was great that he did it, but he didn't align it. It's not on here correctly, and it's off. It's not aligned to the object, so you get these weird shadows down below it because the AO is not aligned to it. Okay, so with his three lights, okay. Now, another thing that was kind of funny is, I came in here and reconfigured this and kind of sent it to the student, and then his comment was, well, you put all this other geometry in here, and I wanted to keep my render times down low, so I didn't want to put all that other geometry. Well, that's an interesting conversation. Yes, I understand. When you're in a time crunch, we might do things like that, but the reality is that I want quality piece, okay, regardless of the render times to a certain degree. So, the thing about it is yes, when you kick up geometry and you add more geometry in it, it does kick up render time, but that's only if we're talking an enormous amount of geometry. The geometry that I put in my scene, it was only 18% more geometry that's in his scene. And actually in render time, it's less because this speaker was an instance, this chair was an instance, this little amplifier is right here is an instance of this one. And so since those are instances, then it doesn't have to recalculate that geometry. So in reality, it was only 11%. So I had 11% more geometry in my scene than his scene, okay? So it's not going to be appreciably different in the rendering time. But the thing that really got me is that he's talking about he wanted to do fast renders, but he came in and made his shadow samples 256. Okay, so if you pick one of his lights here, you'll see that his shadow samples over here are 256. That's an insane amount of samples, and that just took this and made it render about 3 times or 4 times as long because he did that. And the thing about it is because of how much noise that is in this piece, okay, all these patterns and everything, that you'll never be able to see the difference in the quality of the shadow because we're talking about that quality is the penumbra on the edge of the shadow, and you'll never be able to see that. So by kicking this up to 256, he took forever to render and didn't get anything out of it. This piece right here on my machine took 55 minutes and 46 seconds to render, okay? Now, I kept his lighting but I put my objects, my shaders, I alter shaders. You can see in here, see how I'm catching this highlight on the edge of the speaker now? That's because I used a rounded edge. Look at the difference between that and that right here, and it looks so much more dimensional because of that. So my shaders are increased. Another thing I did, you can't tell in this render, but he's got two monitors running, and he put the exact same shader on both of those, which didn't make sense to me. I came back in and put a different shader on one than the other, so I had two different monitors. It's more interesting to look at. Another thing about when you do two monitors, what he did was took the one monitor and then he perfectly moved it over and did a copy of it so they perfectly aligned, and that can't happen in reality. I don't know if any of you have dual monitors. I have dual monitors. You can never get them perfectly to align, and you don't want them to be perfectly aligned in a 3D shot like this. You want to rotate them a little bit, make it off a little bit. We have the ability to make everything digitally and totally accurate in here, which is non-realistic looking. So you don't really want to do that. So I rotated a little bit, put a different shader on here. So when I render mine dropped down 3 minutes. So my render using his lighting went from 55 minutes to 52 minutes because of some of the tweaks I made with the shaders in here. And I've got a lot more geometry than he has in here, and mine looks more interesting, and it rendered faster, okay? And that's with his lights. Now, his lights to me were not very interesting, so I came back and I redid the lights, okay? Now, what I did is, before I did that, is I came in and reset his light to 64 shadow samples. So it's the same lighting, everything's exactly the same, but I changed the shadow samples from 256 to 64, and it dropped down to 20 minutes and 47 seconds to render, from 52 to 47. So less than half the time to render by doing nothing other than changing the shadow samples. And if you took this image and laid it right on top of this in Photoshop and turned on and off and on and off, you wouldn't be able to see any difference between the two, because that difference is in the penumbra on the edge of the shadows, and the shadows are very soft in here. There's a lot of noise. You're not going to see a difference, okay? So that, kicking that up to 256 was just a waste, really, of time, okay? Now, then I came back and relit it the way that I would have lit it, and it looks like this, okay? So his lights, my lights, okay? My lights, now it dropped from 20 minutes, 47 seconds. With my lights, it dropped down to 17 minutes. And let's look at my lights for a second. Here is my lights. I've got 17 lights in here. He had 3, but mine renders faster because of the way that I set them up, okay? Now, I went ahead and kicked mine to 64, okay? I probably could have got down with 32, but I'm going to go 64 because it doesn't calculate much much longer in rendering, so I went for that. Mine are spotlights, okay? So they're discs and spotlights shining down. I put 4 of them, no wait, 5 on the back wall, okay? That's getting me the lighting on the back wall, these lights back here. Okay, nice look back there. And then I have another photometric that's a spot. Instead of a disc, it's a line going along the top of the painting, so like we have a light shining on the painting. Then I have another set of lights that are over the top of the area where the person would be sitting, that are sitting right down on top of it, okay, to illuminate that. And then I have some that illuminate the room that are back here to give me a little more light to illuminate this part of the room back here. Now, you'll also see some Omni lights in here, okay? And I always tell everybody, don't use Omni lights. Well, I use Omni lights for specialty things, and that's to do light linking and give me some rim lighting. So they don't really illuminate the scene. What they're doing is giving me rim lighting, and I'll kind of explain that more a little bit later. So you can see that, in his situation, he's only using 3 lights, okay? So you would have a tendency to think, well, if I'm using 17 lights, mine would take longer to render, but not so because of the way that I'm using them, okay? So here's mine, what mine looks like. Now, the other thing that I have a tendency to do is to try to incorporate some concept into my piece. So since this is a recording studio, I decided I wanted to do something conceptual with that. And so what I did was I came in, and right off the bat, one of the things that kind of bothered me about his a little bit is he's got a book rack right here for books to put in, but he didn't put any books in there. And so I wanted to put books in, so I came in and put books in there. And since this is a recording studio, I made these all manuals, recording manuals, okay? So I came in here and made some books. Now, I have a certain color scheme that I'm dealing with, okay? And so I'm dealing with this kind of a teal, and then there's some orange in here, so I'm dealing with kind of teal and orange. And so I picked books that had kind of blues and teals and oranges in them. So here's initial book. Now, most of the time you go over to Amazon, you can find the front of the book and the back of the book, but you can't ever find the spine. So I actually made the spine to this. So here's one of the books. I wanted to put 3 books in here. Here's another book. Now you'll see the quality of that this bitmap's a lot smaller, but they're going to be so small there it really didn't matter. You see this one's a little bit bigger. And then the third one I did was this one, which was mostly dark, but had some nice oranges in here. And so this was my third book that I put in there, okay? So going into conceptually putting some books on there, okay? Let's just flesh it out a little bit more. It implies certain kinds of human reaction with the room, not just objects in the room, but a human actually using the room. It's subtle, but that's what I wanted to do. Now, the other thing I did is, on his back wall, he had created an acoustical tile. That's what this is an acoustical tile, which I applaud him for doing that. So he did some research, and he knew that you put acoustical tiles. But in most studios, recording studios, the acoustical tiles are not, these were almost hung just like they're paintings on here or something. Acoustical tiles cover the entire wall. And so I came back in and made acoustical tiles on the entire wall. Now, these acoustical tiles are just a box, so it's 18 polygons, and then they're all instances. And so I don't know, there's about maybe, I don't remember how there are about 40 of them in here, but they're all instances of that 18 polygons. And so they're going to render pretty fast. I put little beveled edges on them so you catch some interactive highlights on those. Okay. But the other thing I wanted to do is, I like the idea that he had some painting on the wall or some kind of wall. So what I did is the way I kind of lined mine to put a painting in here. And now another thing that I did, which is all just subtle things, these are all just subtle things, is where I placed the camera, okay? His camera that he was rendering from, okay, is, so let's go back and look at this really quick. Okay, when you look at where his camera is, and then I pull it up in his scene, his camera, and you can look down here, it's 2.5 feet off the ground. So in other words, whoever was going to shoot this photograph had to come in here and kneel down on the ground, maybe get on his belly to shoot this shot. And that's not a normal kind of shot. Normally a camera should be placed about 5.5 feet off the ground. That's, what somebody that was walking into the room would do. And so that's what I did with mine, is my camera is at a different angle because it's like I walked up with a 35 millimeter camera and took a photograph of the room. So that's all a psychological thing. Can you do weird angles? Yes, you can. But in a situation like this, I don't want my camera to be a character. When you start putting it down, worm's eye view and bird's eye views, then the camera becomes a character, and I want to focus on what's inside of the piece, not the camera. Okay, so I decided to put a painting back here. So right off the bat, I had to decide, well, what kind of painting, what do I want to put back there? Well, I knew right off the bat I wanted to do something with a teal to kind of keep this teal pattern, coloration going on in here. So the first thing I did is went over and did a search for one of the illustrators that I like, a guy named Ken Taylor. He's he kind of does posters, so they're kind of silk screen looking. They're graphic, but they're kind of illustrative too. And so I went over here and, did a search for his, okay? Now, because this was a recording studio, and I wanted it to be somewhat current, so not do something, vintage, but do something current, I decided that what I wanted to do was, I played with the idea of a Mad Max movie called Fury Road, okay? Mad Max has a movie, a current one, and it's called Thunder Road, and there's this really weird audio vehicle that's in it. This guy is playing as they're running around. It's kind of bizarre kind of scene. Here's the concept art from it. And then here's an actual photograph of it. And I thought, well, this would be cool if I do something that kind of goes with this, because it's audio, music. And so I decided that I wanted to do something like that in the wall. Okay. Another kind of cool thing that's going on right now is in one of my hard surface classes, one of my students is actually constructing this. Okay. So I'm actually, working with him on modeling this. So it's kind of cool. So I did a search on that, and I found that Ken Taylor did do a poster for Fury Road. And so I thought, okay, this is great. It's perfect. The coloration's right with it, with the teal and some orange in here. And so that's what I did to put on the wall. So there's concept, music to the movie. Okay. And then the other thing that I did, which was kind of interesting, is I came in here and there's a mouse pad right in here. And what I did for the mouse pad is I actually went over and used Thunderdome mouse pad in here. So here it is. There's the Thunderdome poster. Had some nice oranges and stuff. So I thought this, I initially was going to go back to the original Mad Max, but this worked perfect. The right coloration for what I needed. Mel Gibson, Tina Turner, Thunderdome. And so I used that as the mouse pad that's in here. So the past Mad Max, current Mad Max, a lot of concept in here, okay? Now, you can't really tell. It doesn't matter that you can tell, okay? The thing about it is that, when you're talking to people and you're telling them what you're doing, that perks them up that, oh my gosh, you're actually putting concept that's in here, okay? So the other thing I did is wanted to incorporate a few other color in here. So in his original piece, he had this keyboard blue, and I know the reason he got it blue is because that's what color it came when he found it, okay? I changed it to a teal, so I'm using this teal color here. You got some pulled over here under this other chair, teal in here, so we got a nice accent going in here. And then I also put a set of keys in here, which also, kind of pulled through with the idea of a vehicle, driving a vehicle, keys. And then I made the keys a teal color too. Now I also came back in and took this orange that's in here, and I came over and I made this on and off button right here, orange, or actually, I don't know if that's on and off. But anyway, this button on here, this orange, very slight. There's some orange in the keys back here. I put these knobs as being orange here, and then the little buttons on your keys as being orange. So I'm pulling that orange through here too. So it's conceptual, and also where I'm using color theory and bringing in certain colors into it to, so it's still monotone, which is what the student wanted, a monotone kind of black and gray, which is fine. But then I'm putting accent colors in here to make it more interesting. Okay. Then, let's see what else I got in here. Okay. Now what I also wanted to do is, this highlights that are on here are pretty interesting, but I really wanted a reflection of an HDRI into it. So what I did was I decided and went out and found an HDRI image to use in my piece. Now, usually I would want to do an interior, but I was only going to see the reflections a little bit into this. So I found something that was kind of dark, like my room, and then had some blues and greens and oranges in it, which would be nice to reflect back into my actual piece. So I came in and I wanted to do that. Now, initially, that's an HDRI is not going to help me in this situation because this is a closed room. And an HDRI, basically what it does is for your reflection, is it puts in a dome around your room, so you really wouldn't see any of it in here. Now, I could have taken the time and plugged the HDRI into each one of the shaders that I wanted, specifically into the environment slot, then it would show up. But the easier thing to do was to just delete part of the room. So I came to the back wall and the ceiling and deleted them out. Now, if I was using a daylight system, that wouldn't have helped me because then all the daylight would leak in. But we're not really using a daylight system in here, so it worked fine. So now here it is once I have the HDRI coming back in here. So look at the difference right here on this speaker between that highlight and this highlight. Can you see those greens going through there and kind of fleshing this out right in there? So that's kind of the things that this HDRI added to it, just slight little reflections. You can see right over here on this pole, there's a little bit of a green reflection right there that's not here. On this microphone, there's a little green highlight right there. There's a green highlight on this monitor. There's green highlight on this bar right here that wasn't in the original one. So it's subtle things, and that's kind of the way an environment like this is. You build them up, little subtle things, a little bit of here, a little bit of there, a little bit here, a little bit there, and that's how you build it up, okay? I also threw some cords down here, another kind of human element. So threw some electrical cords down here. I decided I didn't want to keep with the orange and the blue. The teal. I wanted to put another color in here, so I put purple in here, and I did purple because I have a recording studio and I have purple cables. So hey, it's a concept of me in there. Okay, and so once I got it, then I went and did my post-production on it. Okay, so this is the final piece once I've gone in and done all of my post-production. Things that I did is, yes, I did 2 ambient occlusions. I did an ambient occlusion wide, an ambient occlusion tight to put on here. I also did a fake depth of field. I didn't render a Z depth because I didn't really have a lot of depth in here. So what I did is I did a blur, a camera blur, a lens blur in Photoshop, and then I did a gradation. So this is my focal point. So it starts getting more blurry as it goes away from that. I also, of course, I did vignetting, so the corners are a little bit darker. Notice it's very subtle. It doesn't jump out at you. And then I also did, I came in and desaturated a little bit. The ground was very saturated. You know, when you're doing digital, things become very kind of saturated. So I desaturated that. I used the vibrance tool to do that. And then I added some chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is when you, photographers shoot photos. What happens is everything in the center is very accurate, but if you start get drifting to the edge, then it's not as accurate, and you'll start getting your reds and your green pixels shifting on you. And so, you know, photographers work really hard to get that out of theirs, but we as, 3D artists, we kind of put it in ours sometimes to give it a little more photographic look. And so mine's got some chromatic aberration in it, and I'll show you how I did that in a few minutes. Another thing I did is I came in and put this microphone in here. You know, the student had the microphone, but he had it out here. It's like, well, why do you want it out there? Let's put it in here. So it's a nice, another element inside of here. Now, the other thing that I did was I did light linking, okay? And light linking is where you take a light. Let's go over here and look. Here's one of my lights right here, this Omni. I use Omnis in this case because they're kind of stupid, and I don't need them to do anything physical. I just need them to illuminate, and they'll illuminate from here to Pluto by default. So what I did was I light linked this to the chair. So in other words, when I was looking at my initial render, the back of this chair was completely black, and I wanted to be able to see a little bit of that pattern. Now, I didn't want it as hot as what's in here, but I wanted to see it a little bit more. So what I did is I linked this light. So in other words, you come over here and you have an include and an exclude setting on your Max. So if I pick the light and I click include, then I can go in here and include it to the chair so that it is only illuminating the chair, doesn't illuminate anything else, okay? Another one I did is this one here, which is linked to the microphone, okay? I did another light linking in here because see this nice highlight that's running down the edge of the microphone? That wasn't in here. So with the lighting, the microphone was just black, but I wanted this nice lighting in here. So I linked the light to it, okay? Then the other thing that you can do, which I do quite often, is under advanced effects, you can come in here and tell it what you want to shine on, okay? Do you want it to affect the diffuse? A lot of times I don't. I'm trying to just add highlights to a black surface. So I come in here and tell it specular, and then it will only highlight on the specular and not on the diffuse. So you can control that too. So you do light linking, and I can actually tell it what to affect, okay? So through that light linking, I was able to get this nice highlight along the edge of this to pop it out. So let's just kind of look at it, and I'll go over real quick what my pipeline is here. Okay, so there is the original render, okay? Then I came in here and did an auto contrast on it. You can see how it kind of popped my contrast a little bit, okay? And then I came in here, and now I'm putting my ambient occlusions back on here. These are my ambient occlusions, adding a little bit of shadowing in some areas to kind of set them down, okay? Then I came back in, and I actually added in some problems and painted some things out, okay, because there were some issues with some of the things that I didn't like, okay. As an example, when I did that HDRI, can you see this reflection that's putting on here? That's a reflection from the HDRI, and I didn't like that, okay. But I could have rotated the HDRI, but if I rotated, it would change all the other ones, and I just wanted that. I went out, so I just came in Photoshop and just painted it out, okay. Just little things I duplicate and kind of fix in Photoshop. Another one is, let me get closer. I didn't like that little highlight right there. It was drawing my eye right there in the center of this little white dot right there. And I thought the reflection was a little bit hot. And I couldn't go back and re-render this. I was trying to figure out what that highlight is. And then I realized on my panels back there, they're catching a highlight off the lighting, which has caused that. Well, the easiest thing is just come in here in Photoshop, paint that out instead of trying to re-render that. So you do in post-processing sometimes. We do some, painting on things as well, okay? Now, on my chromatic aberration, let me kind of show you that. I got in here close. Okay, if you'll look at this area right here, okay, right on this microphone. Now I'm going to turn this on and off. Can you see that green and red popping in there? That's chromatic aberration, okay? And how I do that is I go onto my layer, so I just copy the photo and put it back onto itself, and then I come in here in its layer styles, and I turn off everything but the red. So in other words, this image, the only channel it's going to show on here is the red, and then I shift it over. Let me disable my layer mask. I shift it over, and it's doing it over the entire piece, okay? But then I do a layer mask in here, so you don't see it in the center, you only see it on the edges, which would happen on a camera. So I shifted the red on this one, and then over on the other side, look right in here, I'm shifting the green this way. So I'm shifting the green on the left side, I'm shifting the red on the other side, and these are very subtle little pieces, but they give it a little bit more of a photographic look, and that's called a chromatic aberration, okay? All right, then I came back in and I copied that at this point, and then I came in and added a lens blur on this. So I went into filters, blur, lens blur, and I added a lens blur to this, okay? I didn't add too much, but I added a lens blur to it. You'll see it right there, so before and after with the lens blur on it. And then I came in here and I did a gradient mask on it. So there was no blur in here, but blurred out there. And then I turned it down to, looks like I was using 30% on this one. That's not math. That's just you have to look at it so that I get a slight blur in here. Get in close to look at it. Add a slight blur to this out here. Okay, more photographic. And then I did my vignetting on the corners because when you're shooting with a camera, it gets darker in the corners. So looks like that, but that's too much. And then I kicked it down to 26% to get the final, just a little bit of darkness in the corners. And then the last thing I did was I did an adjustment on my vibrance, my saturation. You can kind of see it in here. Look at the floor. That's before, and this is after. Can you see kind of how that red is kind of blooming in there, which is a little unrealistic? So I just desaturated it a little bit, which brought it back down into reality, and that's what my final piece looked like. So that's what I wanted to go over, is just show you, the student that did this environment made a very nice environment. It's a very good piece for them, but I'm just kind of, I kind of take people's work every once in a while, and I'll just rework it to kind of show you some additional things that you can kind of do to your work to punch it up to really make a really, really nice portfolio piece. Okay? So hopefully through this lecture you learned a little bit more about, rendering, a little bit more about understanding, the rendering pipeline from shaders to your lights, and then the rendering itself, the renderer. So knowing that you can upgrade your quality by dealing with, the quality of the shader a little bit, and also dealing with the quality of the lights, with specifically the shadows in the light, and how to get a little bit higher quality, and then adjusting with the renderer, but not going overboard and kicking your renders out. I mean, some of you people were telling me it was taking 12 hours to render your scenes, and I don't know what your render settings were. Maybe what it was is just you had your render settings so high that, it was making those crank up. Okay. So, and hopefully you understand, and I showed you some different things about the piece, how I would treat this, add a little concept to it, add, color theory into it, adding some different kinds of colors into it to give it a little bit more personable, adding personable attributes to it to make it seem like an actual human is using the room. So these are small conceptual things. It's kind of, I kind of treat it and kind of talk to it. It's kind of like adding sprinkles on ice cream. You want to, you take the ice cream and you put some little sprinkles of nuts on it, little sprinkles of different kinds of, maybe some chocolate chips. And so it's just small little steps and a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, but that's how you end up with getting a great piece. It's those last little bitty parts that really take it over the top and make stunning piece that when you're showing it to a potential employer, that you're selling yourself with all these little things that you did, as well as showing you that you've got a brain and it's got concept in it. And it really kind of impresses the employers than just, oh, it's a pretty picture. Okay. I think that's it for today. All right. Thank you very much.